advisor on executive board for Meteorology Club, and I will be presenting our next speaker, Ben Gelber. Ben Gelber has been a meteorologist for NBC4 for over 30 years, where he has been responsible for performing weather forecasts and reporting on science and the environment. Prior to beginning his career with NBC4, he received his undergraduate degree in geography from Penn State before going to Northern Illinois University for his master's degree in atmospheric science. Alongside his duties with NBC4, Ben has been active with local community organizations and schools, doing public appearances at various events, and even being a guest lecturer for the OSU Geography Department, teaching Geography 520 back when Ohio State was on the quarter system. He has written several op-eds and newspaper articles on climate change and Pennsylvania weather in newspapers including the New York Times and Columbus Dispatch, academic journals including the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society, and books such as the Pennsylvania Weather Book. From these achievements, as well as others, Ben has received awards including the American Meteorological Society Television Seal of Approval, a regional Emmy, recognition by the Associated Press for outstanding weather operation, and an honorable mention by the Associated Press for best regularly scheduled weather segments.
Thanks for inviting me. This is always a fun conference symposium, and the fact that we have these at all is a pleasure, not only to see all of you in attendance. Some of you I've probably met or received emails from over the years. I'm still hearing from students that I talked to 30-some years ago. In fact, I'll occasionally have a student come up to me and say, I remember, Mr. Gelber, when you came to my second grade class. And of course, they're adults. It's like, so yes, I am that old. And hearing Alan's talk as well, and I fully remember the level of operations back in the 1980s, let alone the early 1990s. And I often joke with the lack of detail and resolution, I wonder how we got anything right or knew what was going on at all. Somehow we got on the air, but in television and for NBC, everything has changed. And we didn't even do direct severe weather cut-ins when I started. Compared to the wall-to-wall coverage that we're accustomed to today, it actually is a lot different. More importantly, of course, the visuals, the early warning, the much better coordination with the National Weather Service, especially in the last 20-some years. We had a good relationship going back to the early 90s. Dick Hathaway, in particular, Alan knows, did a great deal in helping get us some climatological histories put together. But that has continued to improve, and it's obviously absolutely essential if we want to get warnings out. Without further ado, I'm going to show a couple of videos that I put together and answer, because I want to leave at least a little bit of time for some questions. One of the coolest things that we can now show is with dual polarization. Before we had the horizontal beam catching intensity, and now with the vertical component to find non-precipitation targets. And the tornado you'll see, or a storm coverage, I believe was Wilmington's first look at a debris ball, and we happen to have that on our composite radar as well. But first we're going to look at a microburst. And this, a lot of television is about getting lucky, and still is. And I happened to, this was a run-of-the-mill garden variety isolated thunderstorm that formed last summer in over downtown Columbus. And for some reason I had the wherewithal, and it was during the news, I told the desk, can we go ahead and roll on our sky cam? Figuring, well, hopefully we'll get a couple of, maybe a lightning bolt. This is what we actually got.
Holy cow. Wow.
And we're looking southeast toward downtown Columbus. And I think it's because we had no storms obstructing our view of our camera several hundred feet up. But you can just watch, hopefully you'll see the rain shaft, and then boom, here comes the tumbling of the air and rain just on the left side. And you can see how all the rain shadow, obviously no rotation with this, just a, here we go with the grand finale. It's kind of like red, white, and boom for meteorologists. So that was pretty cool. This was shared, I sent it to some friends at the Weather Channel, including Mike Bettis, a former colleague, Channel 6, and Dr. Greg Forbes. They did a great job in analyzing that particular event. But the main thing was just that we had it, talked about it extensively that night. Now we're going to roll the videotape. This composite I just kind of threw together. Consider it kind of a mashup of storms that for the most part I've either worked, with the exception of one storm that was before my time. We'll start with a little bit of audio which indicates coverage, but this can be, we can get some talking points out of this, which is one thing I'll try to do. Go ahead and give this a shot. This is
hailstorm took down leaves and branches. Look at that, Colleen. Cabin and
May 2014.
1¼ inches in diameter. That's a $half size hail, and that's where you had that huge purple core. At the time, the tornado warning was issued just to the south and west. I would think the tornado would be hiding right in here, because there's an indication of a debris ball right there. So this is the most dangerous part of this particular storm. Now, these storms cycle,
see the hook echo,
they rotate for a while and then lose some of their potency, but nonetheless, a storm, one of the two storms we've been tracking for the past hour.
That was an F2. Now, this line of storms was March 1st, 2012. Again, large hail with large updrafts being an important component of trouble. This is the Henryville, Indiana tornado. That outbreak, I believe, took 44 lives, including 3 in Moscow, Ohio. This is the elementary school and junior high. No one was seriously injured there, luckily, but there were several fatalities. This was a long track, very early season tornado, one of 7 on March 2nd of 2012. A miracle that but the students were positioned in the right place. And then we'll shift to Moscow, Ohio, right there. You can see the storm between Louisville and Cincinnati. This storm came across the Ohio River and killed 3, again, in Moscow, damaged about 50 buildings in a small town, which we sent a reporter to. Now, that's Fairdale, Illinois. This is the more typical traditional when I do severe weather stories. That's an EF4 tornado. And you can see how much clearer the visibility is for storms in the south. That would be Mississippi, April, I believe, 27, 2011, one of a record 200 or 199 tornadoes that day, 355. That's the Birmingham, Tuscaloosa tornado. You can see and that's a more typical Ohio tornado. That's a Marion County storm. But you can see structurally, our storm's not as strong. Now this is Xenia. This was shot by a 16-year-old student. It's the only video or film, 8mm film that we know of, or else we wouldn't have this, where you can actually see the multiple vortices. There were at least 2 funnels that combined, but we think, if you look closely, there are perhaps upwards of 5. This turned into a half-mile wide tornado on the ground for more than 30 miles, about 60 miles southwest of Columbus, April 3rd, 1974, the super outbreak. Additional storm damage, this is April, I believe April 3rd, 1999, in Cincinnati, Blue Ash tornado. Again, you can see the location of the tornado, which I highlighted there. That had 2 fatalities. This is the last tornado to hit Columbus, the old-fashioned smart cell cameras, October 11, 2006, 3 funnels over northeast Columbus. And this shocked us. They came down, and this proves tornadoes do hit Columbus. 67 homes were damaged. Fortunately, no one was even injured. Weather Service did a great job of getting the warnings out. That's reported on the scene the next day, 2x4s, kind of traditional damage that you would expect, and they become missiles. More typical storms do leave ground swirls and some trees sheared off. Our storms are not often as dramatic. This is Knox County. You can see 2x4s driven into a building. This was probably an EF1, as I recall, but again, damage very localized. Warnings come out just in time. Compare that to Xenia Part 3. This would be September of 20th of 2000. That was an EF or an F4. This is Van Wert, November 10th, 2002. That would be an EF4. This is the storm, the unseasonal storm, one of 19 that day. Trucks and cars wound up in the theater seats. That theater was occupied. I talked to the theater owner, who told me the manager As you probably know the story, that's Union County, took everybody into the center of the building. Nobody was hurt in that theater, which is incredible. That same day, wall cloud over Columbus did not spawn a tornado over us. Helicopters are getting, that's not our video, I think Oklahoma, I think they get too close, for safety, not realizing how wide these circulations are. But this is part of the new era about 10 years ago. And then you can see the tornado ratings with the EF scale. These are Ohio storms. You see how the damage ramps up from sheared trees to cars toppled as you get into EF1. You see the wind scales at the bottom. Damage from an EF2 tornado that I believe was Circleville, EF3, and that's up in Wood County, EF4 damage in 2010. That was one of the also the most devastating storms. 5 persons died in that in Northwest Ohio. And then typical, as you guys have probably gotten used to seeing, this was a hook echo though that did not touch down. It was October 4th, the week before the October 11th tornado that did touch down in northeast Columbus. But as we got it, we have better representations of shear markers now. But we could pinpoint based on the program where rotation would form down to street level. This was something relatively new for us about, again, a decade ago when this kind of technology became more readily available. You see the lavender hail core, and again, I'm not sure if that's the exact indication of where the rotation was. This did not spawn a tornado, but a rotating supercell right through the heart of Franklin County. We're actually lucky nothing touched down, but you can sure see the indentation or inflow. And then typical with coverage, we're hearing the sirens. There's the storm in the upper left. The warnings appear in the lower left. And then most of our tornadoes are QLCS spin-up events. You can see that max there, 30 from 2000 to 2013 from Columbus to Louisville. They're the trickier ones because you could issue a whole bunch of warnings, as the Weather Service will tell you, and you're just trying to gauge, again, spin-ups, they may come and go before warning gets out, but you get these along squall lines, and you look for little kinks in the line, but you can get multiple lines. So as we track these, some warrant tornado warnings, and you may, by the time the warning gets out, the storm may have come and gone, and that's the difficult part of this. We put up banners like this. Of course, National Weather Service going down after these events, and you will see momentarily, I believe, a storm velocity, when you take storm motion out, what this looked like, red moving away, green toward radar. But every single one of these set now from National Weather Service, it could have been a tornado warned storm. You see all these various indentations or inflow notches, and then we put trackers on these. Now this is New Orleans, just to show you that this was this year. We didn't cover this obviously on air, but that's what the storm looked like. There's the dual pole. This would have been February 8, 2017. It was an EF3, peak winds 150. And again, where the shear markers, if that had been our storm, of course TVS may not necessarily translate into a tornado on the ground. That's why we have the shear markers. But our system would have shown minus 77, so that's inbound velocity in green, plus 64, which is outbound velocity in red, would equal 137 mile-per-hour gate-to-gate shear, but you kind of get an idea of what the New Orleans tornado would have looked like had we tracked that in real time. So that's kind of a very fast overview, and I want to get to your questions as well, since it's getting close to lunch. I hate to be the speaker right before lunch because everybody's really hungry, and I've been in that situation. What questions might you have? Obviously, I've seen a wide range of changes in storm coverage and how we break in. I mean, I remember when I broke in for the Cardington, Ohio storm, which was pretty sure was an F4, that hit downtown Cardington up in Morrow County, about 40 miles north of here, northeast, on a Sunday, and I interrupted Meet the Press at the time and got a number of phone calls. You just don't do that for storms, and at that time it wasn't often done, but and the problem with that storm is that warning went up when the funnel came down, which was kind of late, but we didn't have Doppler radar. Morrow County is about halfway between well, back then it would have been Columbus and Mansfield radar. There were thunderstorm warnings, which implied tornado warnings. Again, another example of what we're up against, in that November 10th, 2002 Van Wert storm. Our job is to go on the night before and say we're in a situation that warrants concern. It may be November 9th, and tomorrow's November 10th, and most of our major outbreaks, be it Palm Sunday of April 1965, which you may or may not recall has that iconic, looks like a two-column twin tornado. There were several of those. That one, which pops up right away on the internet, that one was between, I believe, Goshen and Elkhart, Indiana. If you went up 33 into Indiana, but that was the first, modern photograph of something quite that dramatic. That storm produced 2 F4 tornadoes in Ohio and took, I think, upwards of 47 lives. Certainly one of the worst. But the common characteristics of whether it's Palm Sunday, deep low, Minnesota to Michigan, November 10th, 2002, deep low over Indiana, April 3rd, 1974, deep spinning low just to the west, which is associated with a very strong low-level jet. Essentially when we hit on all cylinders in terms of the parameters, but in particular, we get into the most trouble when low pressure passes over Indiana, eastern Illinois, lower Michigan. And May 31st, 1985, when I was early on in my career, which is absolutely the most devastating tornado outbreak for northeast Ohio, and especially where I grew up in Pennsylvania. Well, I grew up in northeast PA, for western and central Pennsylvania, with a stunning number of storms, 11 tornadoes in Ohio, 21 in Pennsylvania, including 4 border crossers, 64 deaths in Pennsylvania, 12 deaths in Ohio. And at 3 o'clock that afternoon, I remember looking outside and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. We were capped, it was in the mid-80s, and the storm, the cells at that time had put us in all the right parameters, and everybody was wondering, what's going on? Is anything going to happen? Well, boy, did it. Once the lid broke and a 140-knot jet, a mid-level max came through, everything exploded, but suddenly you had F4 and F5 storms developing in northeast Ohio. Now, most of that was outside of our viewing area, though we did have a deadly storm in Coshocton County that evening as storms began to build farther south. But eventually the F5 went through Newton Falls and Niles. You have the story of the fire chief who went on the roof and then sounded the warning. I mean, warnings were not the way things are done today. Things weren't quite so efficient and organized, be it in terms of how media got this stuff on the air. I mean, I hate to say, not that we were clueless, but imagine trying to do all this with Doppler radar, without Doppler radar, with non-animating radar, and you're trying to surmise. You're just not. We weren't seeing what we see today and take for granted. And eventually, that F5 storm went into Pennsylvania. I think there were at least 7 F4s and 1 F5 storm in Pennsylvania alone. But that outbreak ignited in the late afternoon hours of May 31st, 1985. The one that went through near Penn State, the National Forest, was well over 2 miles wide. Nobody was killed, but it went through the forest and wiped out upwards of either 90,000 trees. Just an absolutely incredible. And when I drive by Penfield on Interstate 80, I'm told if you go a little bit to the north, you can still see the scars of that storm from 30 plus years ago. But moving forward after 1985, Xenia had a bad tornado in 1989. Again, it seems like it's always Xenia, and then in 2000. But there was a bit of a lull in the action in terms of large storms, and then we had, I mentioned that 2002 outbreak of 19 tornadoes, which set a daily record. There again, cutting into NASCAR was disastrous from a PR standpoint. And you can only imagine, I mean, cars keep turning left. But yeah, we had a problem going on, and Van Wert had happened, and I saw a rotation over Logan County, Bellefontaine area. And that was a little bit ahead of when or at least I should say a hook echo of sorts. So I figured you can see where this was going. So I went on the air, hundreds of phone calls, get off the air, people swearing, all that, and it was ugly. And but I said, if you live in Union County, you need to get to the basement like right away. And then within a minute or two after I cut in the National Weather Service had issued the tornado warning into Union County, and then I would find out the next day from the Union County EMA that 2 people were hurt seriously. They were flung from their trailer and elevated 50 feet in the air and landed in moist sod. They survived. They came back and visited the station a couple of years later. So we had a very kind of emotional chat. But the Union County EMA director said because I had cut in that those who had basements had taken cover, And outside of the two who were injured, who made, as far as we can tell, nearly full recovery, nobody else was hurt. 12 homes were literally wiped off the streets, and this is a very rural section. So that's why you do what you do. You don't ever apologize to angry viewers, but it was very disheartening to see that kind of selfishness, which we still see today. You know, it's like, if it's a rural tornado, or if it's not in my backyard, or if it's out there, why are you covering it? Well, that's our viewing area, and that's our job, and FCC mandates some form of coverage. We did go to split screen to accommodate NASCAR, because that became a day-long, obviously that event went on for hours. But it was funny, when the funnel cloud got into, or excuse me, when the warnings got into the metro area, all the phone calls stopped, then everybody got it. So that's the mentality that we're up against. You know, it's kind of funny, but trust me, it was not a very pleasant experience, and we still get calls. If I cut in for Pike County, rural Pike County, as I have, they're going to get phone calls. I had to make a dreaded cut-in during the Olympics for a few minutes. If there's a warning, you got to get on. I mean, you have to make some rough decisions. They're not popular, and you realize if you go into this field, you know, it's not all fun and games and being on TV and chasing, you know. Plus, I've seen the devastation that storms have done. Not until 1999 did I actually get out for a field survey of sorts and report it, and boy, that changes your whole perspective. It's, storms are no longer exciting. I mean, lives are at stake. Lives were lost. I saw in Cincinnati and Blue Ash cement floors, and that was it. I saw a cement floor with a stairwell, and that was it. You know, and then houses next door unscathed, and what was an F4 tornado at that time, which incidentally hit at 5 in the morning. Even the storms that we had, we counted 7 tornadoes on March 1st of this year in southern Ohio, 6 west, southwest, and central, and I was on from 2 to 7 that morning, and then came back and did the weather for the rest of the evening, because, you know, you just go on, you're on. And while those were smaller, every one occurred between about 2:30 and 8:30 in the morning, which historically, if you chart things out, is the least likely time to have storm issues here. So that, and I've tried to, during this week, we try to bust tornado myths, as the Weather Channel has done for years, reminding folks, yes, storms hit urban areas, maybe obviously much less frequently, whether it's Columbus or at least 2 significant tornadoes in Brooklyn, New York, one while my son was interning there. Stuff hits where it hits. You know, there may be more impediments, but it's not impossible. You know, yeah, sure, the big storms have been in Dayton, or excuse me, well, Xenia, multiple times. Akron, Canton, Toledo, Cleveland has taken several major hits over the past century. You know, northern and western Ohio, and then the Ohio River counties, where the terrain is flatter and more conducive to storms. But then you have October 26th of 2010, where we had either 11 or 12 tornadoes, I think 11. Most of those were in hilly southeastern Ohio. We had supercells, and you think, well, most of the rotation might stay aloft, but it didn't. 2 tornadoes that were significant hit Perry County. Damage unlike we've seen, certainly I've seen in Perry County that I could find in the records, which is the northern edge of the Hocking Hills. I showed one storm that went up the hill toward OU and then down the hill and carved a continuous path going upslope and then downslope. You know, I mentioned 1985 tornadoes crossed the rugged Appalachians May 31st. Well, that was our event that showed that storms can hit the Appalachian foothills and hold their integrity, and that storm ended pretty close to Ohio University, hit the town called the Plains, and there were 11 tornadoes. The other climatological change since I've been here is a huge uptick in what we call a second tornado season in the fall that you may have noticed. I mean, probably from 1980, when I started as a green rookie, like I say at the age of 12, so that way I'm not like this, it appears. But when I started after finishing college in grad school, until 1980 to 1998, there might have been 1 or 2 October or fall events that, you know, and again, we do, Weather Service, you know, does far more detailed storm surveys, so we find more tornadoes too when you match up rotation and wind shear. A lot of storms were written off as wind damage that might have been F-zeros back in the day. But anyway, next to nothing happened. And then suddenly in 1999, Circleville, in 2000, in September, which is not that late in the year, in Xenia, September 20th. And then the list goes on and on. 2002, 19 tornadoes on November 10th. 2003, we had an outbreak in Northeast Ohio, did a lot of damage to the OSU campus of Worcester. And then coming through, I mentioned in 2010, in both September and October. In recent years, 2013, which you saw where we had all those little boxes on the QLCS event at the end. That was a Halloween night. We've had two storms now after the start of astronomical winter, and I believe in 2014 and 2015. I think one was confirmed and one might have been a tornado warning. A number of February warnings. Has this ever happened before? Of course. There was a tornado outbreak long before I came here in February 1971. There have been January storms and so on. But it's more the clustering of events that we might call out of season that we now appropriately call second season. And I can only theorize here, and I could be wrong, which will be the first time, but my sense is, looking at, I work with the OSU state climatologist, Jeff Rogers, on average dew points, and they have increased since the mid-20th century along with average temperature by a full 2 degrees, kind of in lockstep from the 60s to this past decade. So we're dealing with more juice, more available moisture. We know autumn and spring temperatures average about 1 degree warmer. It could be that we're stacking the box a little bit in favor of earlier and later storms, or lengthening the tornado season compared to my era of growing up in the 60s and 70s, or even when I started here in the colder or cooler 1980s. Now, what I found interesting was there was a clustering of large tornadoes in the 1940s that happened to hit Akron and Canton in 1953, from Flint, Michigan to Worcester, Massachusetts, that were historic and also helped spur the eventually modern warning systems. But then we look back at the average dew points in the 1940s, at least here in Ohio, and they were comparable to this past decade. So there seems to be a perfect correlation, again, a combination perhaps of more of a predominantly southwesterly flow in the jet stream might match up with the warmer temperatures, and some of this could be cyclical. And then what we see today, where we can certainly, again, quantify higher dew points. In other words, more moisture in the atmosphere, more fuel, and more importantly, perhaps, higher Gulf and Atlantic temperatures. That energy is evaporating into the air. So those are just some observations from the time I've been here. Do you have any questions for me on how we make a decision-making process before we wrap up for lunch? And I'll leave you with my email in a second, because you can always hit me up later. Anything that I can answer real quickly for you guys? Yes?
Talk a little bit, if you could, about the need to be competitive with the other broadcast outlets in your market, and how that does, could, or should affect consistency of message.
Well, I've been fortunate at our station, and the whole time I've been here, I've never, for example, I can't speak for other places, colleagues at other stations, we've not been told to hype an event. We know, and we have operating procedure to get on the air for the length of a tornado warning. If a storm is dissipated and it's on the fringe, we can break off into more intermittent cut-ins, but that's only if we know that the storm is weakened. Certainly we're monitored by ratings. You can't get away from that, by perception of news managers. But personally, I've been left alone in the sense that you just go instinctually with what you see. I mean, you feel like you're calling play-by-play. You just tell the director we need to go on, we go on. They ask me if we want to lead the news with something based upon the degree of severity, whether it's the next day or a few hours from now, how much time do you need for weather. So I can't say that some decisions aren't at some level aren't based upon that, but I think as long as you show consistency, hopefully accuracy, most importantly timeliness. I mean, nobody can predict everything. I mean, sometimes you're going by the seat of your pants, and as storms develop, you can't predict a tornado is going to hit a certain point. We all know that. Sometimes you can't even predict where a squall line is going to develop, except conditions being right. But and I think my colleagues at other stations would tell you the same thing. You do the best you can, and they understand that. So we're not driven by competitiveness. First of all, I don't know what anybody else is doing, because I've got my, we've got our heads in the game here and our hands full with what we're dealing with. So I don't even know what our competitors have done. But again, a number of them are my colleagues, and we have the same conversations. One or two other questions? Anything else anybody wanted to? Yes?
What would you say is the most memorable event in your 30 plus years in Columbus.
Not necessarily severe weather.
Yeah, any weather, any extended weather event you've had.
All right, I'm in Pennsylvania last week, and I had the privilege of being in 18 inches of snow in the Poconos, and for me that wasn't good enough, so I drove up to a higher elevation east of Scranton where they had 30 inches, and posted lots of video and pictures, and I loved every second of that, because it's like you're a kid. I love tracking snowstorms. You know, you have the nor'easters are a little bit different. Alan mentioned that the March 1993 superstorm, storm of the century, that for us was supposed to be a fringe event. For State College was supposed to be a fringe event. We had upwards of 6 inches. State College had upwards of 18 inches. Models didn't handle necessarily the westward extent of the snow particularly well. It's interesting when storms buckle in a direction that you get surprised, as long as it's in a fun way. I guess because tornadoes and severe weather are more scary, and there's more harm done. I tend to, my happier moments were standing out in the April 3rd, April 4th, on that day, 1987 blizzard at the OSU golf course. And I was standing there, I'd been on the night before, and I thought, since it was now Saturday, I'd do a live shot. And the fellow was filling in, said, well, the storm's winding down, blah, 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 let's go out to meteorologist Ben Gelber at the OSU golf. I'm like, I'm holding onto the microphone, being buffeted by 35-mile-per-hour winds, and I can barely see the cameraman in front of me. I said, no, Brent, the storm hasn't wound down yet. And then we had a record 13 inches of snow, 20 inches in east central Ohio. So that might be one of the most memorable, because I both forecasted it nervously, because snowstorms can go awry so easily, and then went out in it. Certainly memorable was covering the November 10th, 2002 tornado outbreak, which still is the greatest number of tornadoes. And by the way, from the state of accounting, you look at May 10th, 1973, again, long before I was here, a funnel did come down Broad Street into Columbus. There's an iconic shot. I usually bring it out every now and then for a story, shot by the Columbus Dispatch, and you see this full-fledged funnel dangling from off just south of Broad Street. It did hit 14 unoccupied homes. If that hit today, we'd have a disaster. That's why I worry about this stuff. But in 1973, I went and looked back at the records, and there were, I don't know if there were 8 or 10 tornadoes in storm data. And I looked at the newspaper, and they said there were like upwards of 18 to 20 touchdowns. I thought, well, how do we reconcile this? But knowing how things are done today, which means that there's if I understand from the Weather Service, that there's a 2-mile gap between touchdowns, that often becomes a separate tornado. When I looked at storm data in May 1973, they were all long-track storms, including the Columbus storm, that went 50 to 75 miles. I thought, I doubt it. And when you actually looked at county newspapers, you realized most of these storms came up and down. So the newspaper account of, I think, 18 or 19 touchdowns was probably a better accounting of how many tornadoes touched down that day. So the accounting system is different, which is why maybe instead of averaging 600 tornadoes, we averaged 1,200. That part is not climate change. That part is counting more storms. So we always have to be careful. There are legitimate climate change discussions, but we also have to know our science and data collection methods. So I'll leave it at that. Lastly, as many of you, some of you may have, well, 2 things. You can find me on Ben Gelber on Facebook, where I post a lot of stuff like the microburst video, and including stuff I've forwarded on to Dr. Forbes and Mike Bettis, of course his wife Allie was an intern with us for a year or so from OSU, but my work email would be lowercase b Gelber, so it's BGELBER at WCMH.com. It's always good to hear from you guys. As I'm still hearing from students I talked to 10 or 20 years ago. It might be an event, it might be a storm picture, it could be a weather question, but I appreciate that. Thank you very much.